Imagine you've got an Italian assessment. You have to write an essay in class and you go into this assessment, but you don't know any Italian. That's what it's like when you don't know any language features in English ATAR.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome to the second lesson in Module 2. This is really where the fun begins, if you want to call it fun. It's where we actually start getting into the nitty-gritty of the English ATAR content, starting with language features, probably the most important lesson in this module, or at least one of them. Before we get started, make sure that you've watched the previous lesson called Intro to Module 2. That one really sets up the why behind everything that we'll be learning in this module. And if you don't understand the why, probably know where I'm going with this, your brain won't understand why it's important for its survival, for its well-being, and then it just won't learn it. Past WACE exam questions. Here are all the times the term language features has appeared in past WACE exam questions from 2016 to 2022. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these questions. They're in the study notes, but this is something that we'll be doing at the beginning of each lesson in this module, because it helps you, again, understand the why. It helps you see how the concept that we're learning is actually relevant in an assessment context, and what better example of an assessment context than a WACE exam. So as we can see here, there are 6 instances of language features popping up in past WACE exam questions. As we'll see in this lesson, that number is actually quite deceiving. Arguably, this term is important in every single past WACE exam question. Next up, syllabus points. This is also going to be a bit of a fixture in pretty much every lesson in this module. Once again, so you can see how the term or the concept that we're learning is relevant to the syllabus, which is ultimately what you're assessed on. As we can see, we've got 4 syllabus points where language features is mentioned, and there are 40 syllabus points in total. Lesson objectives, what are we going to do? Understand the interplay between features, elements, devices, and techniques. I don't know about you, but those 4 different terms have confused the hell out of me for many years, and this lesson will be explaining the difference between them. A nice framework for you to understand the difference. Then we'll define feature, define element, define device, define technique. After that, we will highlight the essential points, the main thing that you need to remember to understand the difference between those 4 different terms. We'll understand the term language features. It's what we're here for. Then I'll explain language, explain features, breaking it down into their component parts so then we can understand what the term means together. We'll define language features and explain the relevance of the language features Bible. I've hyped this up quite a bit, and you'll be able to download it in the description area below this video. Hopefully, once you see it, you'll understand how useful it can be. After that, we'll understand that your use of language features depends on what type of question you're answering. We'll illustrate how language features are used in analytical questions, illustrate how language features are used in creative questions. Maybe that's ringing some bells from that lesson in Module 1, that we've got analytical questions in the exam, creative questions. Analytical questions come from the comprehending section and the responding section, and creative questions come from the composing section. Then we will comprehend that language features are part of every response that you write. I'll illustrate how analytical questions impliedly require you to state language features, meaning analytical questions don't always explicitly state the term language features, but it's implied that you need to discuss language features. I'll illustrate how creative questions impliedly require you to incorporate language features. The difference there between state and incorporate. We'll get into this. Lastly, we will outline a simple summary. This is also going to be a permanent fixture in just about every lesson from here on in English ATAR Made Simple, because we are all about doing things simply. First up, the interplay between features, elements, devices, and techniques. We hear those words thrown around a lot, and most of us, including me for a long time, actually just assume that they're all synonymous. They all mean the same thing. Look, 80% of the time, you'll be fine if you think that features equals elements, elements equals devices, and devices equals techniques. But, and this is a big but, 20% of the time, you'll do better understanding that Features does not quite equal elements. Elements does not quite equal devices, and devices does not quite equal techniques. Those are very approximate percentages, but you get the gist. It's this 20%, the 20% of the time where you'll do better understanding the difference between these terms, that justifies us having a bit of a discussion about what each term means and how they're different from one another. Starting off with the definition of feature. A feature is a distinct aspect of something. It's a category of devices. It's broad and it's an umbrella term. Here's an example: figurative language features. As you might know, figurative language features is an umbrella term and it includes things like similes and metaphors. How about the definition of element? It is a component of a text. It's broad and it's used interchangeably with a feature, the word that we just looked at. And that part about it being used interchangeably, that is from the 2022 Good Answers book, and you can find that on page 65. Example, just figurative language. Figurative language is an element of a written text. As we see on the slide, it's a component of a written text. How about the definition of device? This one, it is a particular use of language. It's specific. So what we're doing here is it's a bit of a spectrum. We're starting from broad and then going along the spectrum to get more and more specific. Example of a device, metaphor. So as we saw earlier, we've got figurative language. That's a bit of an umbrella term. And then we can refer to figurative language as a feature or an element. Then here we're looking at an example of a feature or an element, which is a device. And the example here is metaphor. Definition of technique. A technique is a device that a particular text creator uses. It's specific. Technique and device are basically the same thing, but the technique is what a text creator is using. You might say that a text creator is known for the devices that they use. Example, Hesse uses lots of metaphors in Siddhartha. Never know how to pronounce the author's name, and Hesse or Hess. Either way, in that book, there are lots of metaphors. Those are the definitions and some examples for those 4 words that we've just had a look at. Your English teacher probably won't like me oversimplifying it like this, but this is the easiest way to understand and explain the difference between the words that we've just looked at. Features and elements, they're basically the same thing, synonymous. Secondly, devices and techniques, they're also basically the same thing, they're synonymous. You probably worked that out based on the discussion that we just had. You saw that features and elements, we regarded them as broad over on this side of the spectrum. And then devices and techniques, we regarded them as specific on the other side of the spectrum. Here's a bit of a visual representation of what we've just established. These are specific devices. Then those devices are categorized according to a feature, which is the umbrella term. That might sound a little bit confusing, so let's go through an example. Explain how an attitude towards mining is expressed through the use of a specific textual feature. This is coming from the 2016 WASTE exam, specifically section 1, question 2. Here we have the feature being figurative language features. Then the devices or techniques are the things that come under the umbrella. As we can see, some devices of figurative language features are personification, metaphor, oxymoron, anthropomorphism, simile, and so on and so forth. Another example. So our umbrella term here is diction. That could be regarded as the feature or the element. Coming under that umbrella term of diction, our devices or techniques are examples of diction, such as invective, direct address, connotation, denotation, slang, and so on and so forth. And all of these things are mentioned in the Language Features Bible, by the way. Next, main section of the lesson, understanding language features. Our first stop is the glossary section of the syllabus document. We'll be coming back to this quite a lot throughout this module. It is the first place we should go to if we're trying to define a key concept. The glossary section of the syllabus defines language features as follows. The features of language that support meaning, for example, sentence structure, noun group, phrase, vocabulary, punctuation, figurative language, framing, camera angles. Choices in language features and text structures together define a type of text and shape its meaning. These choices vary according to the purpose of a text, its subject matter, audience, mode, or medium of production. From this, it would seem that the definition of language features is the features of language that support meaning. In my opinion, that does not help that much at all about actually defining what language features are. Also, what happened to that rule about not being able to use the term that you're defining in the definition of that term? If that's not really working for us, let's see if we can create our own definition that makes more sense than this one. The starting point is to break down each word in this term language features into separate parts. So let's check out language first. I'd like you to imagine that you've just finished your WACE exam, you've gotten an awesome ATAR, you've smashed English, and now you're planning a trip overseas. As to where you'll go, Sweden, Iceland, and Poland have been on the top of your list for years, so that's where you're going to go. And because you're a bit of a language nerd, you want to learn a bit of Swedish, Icelandic, and Polish before you head off. So you can have some basic conversations with the locals, maybe be able to order a few meals, stuff like that. Here is our first key takeaway of the lesson. The 80-20 principle, also known as the Pareto principle, states that 20% of the effort produces 80% of the results. In the context of learning Swedish, Icelandic, and Polish, this would mean that you're going to learn the most frequently used words from each language, and you'd be able to engage in most forms of basic conversations for each language. Put another way, you'll learn 20% of the words and be able to participate in 80% of the conversations. You'll be winning. How on earth does any of this apply to the topic of this lesson, language features? Just like there are multiple spoken languages like Swedish, Polish, Icelandic, there are multiple languages in the context of English ATAR, and they're best categorized as written language. We can pretend that one is Swedish, visual/multimodal language, and we can pretend that one is Icelandic, and lastly, auditory language, and we'll pretend that one is Polish. That is the word language. How about features? How are we going to understand this? We can understand features as a distinct aspect of something. Put differently, the most important words in Swedish, for example, they could be regarded as features of the Swedish language. We've looked at language on one hand and then features on the other. Let's look at both words together and see what it all means. This is our definition of language features. Language features are the popular and frequently used words in written language, Swedish, visual and multimodal language, Icelandic, and auditory language, Polish. Hopefully, this new understanding of language features makes the task of actually learning a bunch of language features far less daunting. What this means is instead of thinking, I'm not going to learn Icelandic, Polish, or Swedish because learning every term in every language will just take so much time and I just can't be bothered. You're now in a position where you can think, all right, for me, all I need to do is just learn the most important words from each language, the most important terms, and that's it. I'll be able to get by. I'm going to treat this as a challenge, just like I would if I was actually learning a real language. Hopefully that last part there about treating this as a challenge and just focusing on learning the 20% of the words that are going to get you 80% of the way. Hopefully that rings the bells from the lessons on the mindsets in module 1. If you haven't completed or watched the lessons in module 1, go and do that. They're essential. I'll be referring to those lessons quite a bit throughout the rest of the course, and they really lay a foundation for doing well in English ATAR Made Simple specifically, and then Year 12 generally. Now let's explain the relevance of what we've just discussed to the LFB, or the Language Features Bible. The Language Features Bible contains approximately 150 features. These represent the most important terms of each language. About 70 of those features have a star next to them. And those 70 star features, they represent the need to know terms of each language. At the very least, you must learn the star features. Hopefully that's some good news to you. This idea of learning 3 different types of language features or 3 different languages is not that hard all of a sudden because it only means learning 70 terms. 70 terms and you understand the main language features you need to know to do very well in English ATAR. What about those other 80? There are 70 star features, 150 language features in total in the Language Features Bible. What should you do with those, if anything? Learning the additional language features that don't have a star next to them in the Language Features Bible depends on, firstly, what your English ATAR goal is. For instance, if your goal is to get an overall scaled mark of, say, 55% in English ATAR, you'll be fine just learning the star features. If, on the other hand, though, your goal is to get an overall scaled score of, say, 80%, you'll want to learn the additional features. That's the first factor. The other factor is how far away the WACE exam is. For instance, your capacity to learn the additional language features would be much greater if the exam is, say, 6 months away compared to if it was 6 weeks away. You'd simply have more time to learn the additional features. You might want to do it. But if the exam was 6 weeks away and you're just watching this lesson now and you've just been exposed to the language features Bible, I would probably just focus on the star features. Now let's talk about how your use of language features will depend on and change based on the category of exam question. In Module 1, we established that there are 2 categories of exam questions: analytical questions and creative questions. The relevant exam sections for analytical questions are the comprehending section and the responding section. And then for the creative questions, those questions are found in the composing section. For analytical questions, you'll use language features by directly stating the name of a feature and then explaining its effect. For creative questions, you'll use language features by incorporating a language feature to create an effect. The difference between how you use language features in analytical questions versus creative questions is vitally important, and it'll be coming up quite a bit in this module. We'll be going through lots of examples about this. Don't worry if it sounds a bit confusing at the moment, but just flag it as something that is going to be important, and you will start developing a better understanding of it as you engage in more of the activities in this module and more practice writing. Let's have a look at language features in analytical questions. Here is an example of how language features are used in analytical questions in the comprehending section of the exam and the responding section. Explain how your response to this image is affected by 3 visual language features. And this is the image. So obviously this wasn't a text in a past exam, but maybe it will be in this year's exam. You never know. The question is a blend of question 1 from the 2017 WACE exam and question 1 of the 2019 WACE exam. Our example question falls under this category of analytical because it must be answered with direct reference to a text. In this case, it's the image on the screen. In other words, you need to analyze the text in order to answer the question. Bearing that in mind, I might write in my response something like this. Notable aspects of Chris Rock's facial expression include his squinted eyes and open mouth. These aspects suggest he is experiencing pain and shock as a result of what has just transpired, which in turn encourages me to respond with sympathy. Comments based on what I've just read out. Firstly, I directly stated the name of the feature in the phrase, Chris Rock's facial expression. Facial expression, language feature. Secondly, I explained the effect of the language feature in the second sentence, which was, suggest he is experiencing pain and shock, which in turn encouraged me to respond with sympathy. That's an example of how language features are used in analytical questions. Now let's discuss briefly how they can be used in creative questions. Example, I don't think you quite understand the ramifications of this decision. Incorporate this statement into a persuasive text for a resistant audience. And this question is from the 2018 WACE exam, section 3, question 10. In response to that question, I might write, Year 12s, I've been informed that you've given up on English ATAR, and hey, I don't blame you. It's confusing and it's time consuming. However, I don't think you quite understand the ramifications of this decision. Let's discuss how a language feature was used in that example. First off, I incorporated a language feature in the second sentence, which was, it's confusing and time consuming. That language feature is preempting, and go and check the LFB if you want to know what that one's all about. Basically, you're preempting someone's counter argument to your own argument. So that's incorporating a language feature. Then what type of effect did my incorporation of that language feature have? It creates an impression of fairness and a lack of bias. Next section of the lesson. Language features are part of every response you write. There will always be at least one term in a question that should ring alarm bells in your head saying state or incorporate language features. As we just learned, you state a feature when answering an analytical question and you incorporate a feature when you're answering a creative question. Related to this point is the following key takeaway. The absence of the term language features in a question doesn't mean you're not required to refer to language features. What do I mean by this? If a question doesn't explicitly tell you to state or incorporate language features, there will be a part of it that implies you should. As we saw at the beginning of the lesson, the term language features only appears 6 times across all the WACE exam questions between 2016 and 2021. But if there's always one term in an exam question that tells you to state or incorporate language features, what about all the other questions? That's what we'll discuss now. Firstly, how do analytical questions impliedly require you to state language features? I created the next few slides back in 2022. This was before the syllabus was updated to reflect that there are now 2 questions in the comprehending section question, but the gist of what I'm getting across remains the same. So bear with me for a second. The WACE exams between 2016 and 2021, there have been 6 of them, which means there have been 54 analytical questions in total across those 6 exams from 2016 to 2021. Language features only appears in 4 of those. This begs the question, what about the remaining 50 questions? The word how appears in 41 of them. Why does how impliedly tell us to state language features? This is a definition of how. It means in what way or a way in which something is done. With this in mind, something is done in a text through language features. What I'm trying to get across here is that whenever you see the word how in an analytical question, alarm bells should be ringing in your head saying, talk about language features. Out of the 54 analytical questions from 2016 to 2021 WACE exams, 4 directly use the term language features and 41 use the word how. What about the other 9 questions? Let's take a quick look at each one. Explain the visual element that has the greatest effect on your interpretation of this image. The visual element, this part of the question, means visual language feature. With reference to at least one text, discuss why a text created in one context may resonate with an audience in another context. Why equals requires discussion of language features. Next question. Compare the effectiveness of the endings of 2 texts to position their audience to respond strongly to their themes or ideas. For this one, you'll compare the effectiveness with reference to language features. Discuss the significance of mode in communicating perspective in at least one text. Communicating a perspective, that term of the question, requires discussion of how a perspective has been communicated. How means language features. Compare the effects of 2 texts either meeting or not meeting your expectations of their genre. You'll need to address how both texts have either met or not met your expectations of their genre. With reference to at least one text, discuss the stylistic choices made by a creator in constructing a text within a particular genre. Stylistic choices refers to the selection of stylistic features, which include language features, to achieve a particular effect. That one's quite confusing. We haven't looked at stylistic choices or stylistic features yet. That's coming soon. This will make sense once we've gone through that lesson. Evaluate the way a narrative point of view is used in 2 texts to convey specific values. The way narrative point of view is used is through language features. Account for the differences in the way 2 texts use generic conventions by considering their context. Again, the way generic conventions are used is through language features. Lastly, discuss the way in which your understanding of context has influenced your interpretation of the perspectives in at least one text. Perspectives are conveyed in text through language features. Those are analytical questions. What about creative questions? How do creative questions impliedly require you to incorporate language features? This one is much easier to understand, in my opinion. Basically, every question in the composing section will include a phrase that either tells you to write a persuasive, imaginative, or interpretive response, or in a form of your choice. And that form must be persuasive, imaginative, or interpretive. Language features are relevant in these questions because in order for you to write a great response in any of those forms, persuasive, interpretive, imaginative, you need to use language features. Alrighty, that is it for this lesson. Let's go through a simple summary of it. The first section of this lesson discussed the interplay between features, devices, elements, and techniques. We learned that 80% of the time, you'll be just fine if you treat the words features, elements, devices, and techniques as all meaning the same thing. 20% of the time, you'll be better off if you understand the nuances in the meaning of each word. The essential points, this was a subheading of this section of the lesson. Features and elements, they have a broad meaning, umbrella terms. Devices, techniques, they're specific. Next section of the lesson, we discuss understanding this term language features. And in this portion of the lesson, we discuss that we're going to efficiently and effectively learn language features using the 80-20 principle, which in this context dictates that learning 20% of the content will be useful 80% of the time. And we broke down this word language into 3 different types of language in the context of English ATAR. We've got written language, and we'll refer to that as Swedish. The connection between written language and Swedish will make sense in the language features Bible. I'm just using a bit of an analogy. Visual and multimodal language is Icelandic, and auditory language is Polish. Then we discussed features. Features refer to the distinct aspects of each language. Then we joined our understanding of language and our understanding of features to come up with a definition for language features. Language features refer to the popular and frequently used words in written language, visual multimodal language, and auditory language. The relevance of the language features Bible. You need to learn star features. Determine whether you should learn additional features by considering your English ATAR goal, which you came up with from Module 1, and how far away the WACE exam is. The next section of the lesson that we've just discussed was your use of language features depends on the category of exam question. Analytical questions refer to questions in the comprehending section and the responding section. Creative questions refer to questions in the composing section. How should we go about language features in analytical questions? We learned that you need to, 1, directly state the name of the feature, and 2, explain the feature's effect. For language features in creative questions, we learned that you incorporate a language feature to create an effect. The final section of the lesson really underscored that language features are part of every response you write in English ATAR. We learned that there will always be at least one term in a question that should ring alarm bells in your head saying state or incorporate language features. One subsection from this part of the lesson discussed how analytical questions impliedly require you to state language features. And there we learned that this is mainly through the use of the word how. We discussed how creative questions impliedly require you to incorporate language features. And for this, we saw that you need to use language features in order to create a persuasive, interpretive, or imaginative response. That is it for this lesson on language features. Make sure you go and check out the activity objectives. Out of all the activities in this entire course, the activities for this lesson are arguably the most important for you to do. As I said at the beginning of this lesson, learning language features in English ATAR is like learning the words of a particular language. If you go to a country, you need to have some understanding of the words if you want to try and communicate with people. The same is true in an English ATAR assessment. You need to be able to use the right words. You need to be able to use the right language in order to do well in it. That's enough from me. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Until then, keep it simple.